On this vote, the yeas are 176, the nays are 241. The motion is not adopted. The question is on passage of the bill. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. The ayes have it.
Speaker, I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote.
It's the final passage vote, a bill repealing numerous provisions. It's the final passage vote on a bill that would repeal numerous provisions of the Education Department's recent rules regarding the eligibility of higher education institutions to participate in federal student aid programs.
On this vote, the yeas are 303, the nays are 114. The bill is passed. Without objection, a motion to reconsider it is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Utah rise?
Mr. Speaker, I send to the desk a privilege report from the Committee on Rules for filing under the rule.
Clerk will report the title.
Report to accompany House Resolution 566, resolution providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 1837 to address certain water-related concerns on the San Joaquin River and for other purposes.
Referred to the House calendar and ordered printed. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the Chair will postpone further proceedings today on the motion to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered, or on which the votes incurred objection under Clause 6 of Rule 20. Any record vote on the postponed question will be taken later. I have no idea what we're doing next. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise? Seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1433, the Private Property Rights Protection Act of 2011, as amended.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1433, a bill to protect private property rights.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Smith, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on H.R. 1433 as amended currently under consideration.
Without objections to order.
And, Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Congressman Sensenbrenner and Congresswoman Waters for introducing H.R. 1433, the Private Property Rights Protection Act, to restore vital property rights protections following the Supreme Court's decision in Kelo versus City of New London. This bipartisan legislation passed the House during the 109th Congress by a vote of 376 to 38, with 99% of Republicans and 81% of Democrats present voting in favor of final passage. Unfortunately, the bill was never voted on in the Senate. Today, over 6 years later, the Kelo decision continues to call out for congressional action. Our founders realized the fundamental importance of property rights. Property rights protections are enshrined throughout the Constitution, including in the Fifth Amendment, which provides that private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation. Despite these protections, in Kelo, the Supreme Court held that the government may take private property from one owner and transfer it to another for private economic development. The dissenting judges sharply criticized the Court's decision, writing that the result of the majority opinion was, quote, effectively to delete the words for public use from the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment. The specter of condemnation hangs over all property. The government now has license to transfer property from those with few resources to those with more. The founders cannot have intended this perverse result, end quote. This legislation essentially reverses this result and prohibits state and local governments that receive federal economic development funds from abusing eminent domain for private economic development. It also prohibits the federal government from using eminent domain for economic development purposes. This bill restores Americans' faith in their ability to build, own, and keep their property without fear of the government taking their homes, farms, or businesses to give to other people. And it tells commercial developers that they should seek to obtain property through private negotiation, not by public force. Too many Americans have lost homes and small businesses to eminent domain abuse, forced to watch as private developers replace them with luxury condominiums and other upscale uses. Local governments often approve the use of eminent domain for private economic development in order to expand their tax bases. And federal law currently allows federal funds to be used to support condemnations for the benefit of private developers, which encourages this abuse nationwide. As the Institute for Justice's witness observed during our hearing on this bill, quote, using eminent domain so that another richer, better connected person may live or work on the land you used to own tells Americans that their hopes, dreams, and hard work do not matter as much as money and political influence. The use of eminent domain for private development has no place in a country built on traditions of independence, hard work, and protection of property rights, end quote. Americans' homes are their castles. Federal taxpayer dollars should not be used to fund the battering ram of eminent domain abuse. I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan legislation to restore the Constitution's broad protections for private property rights. Mr. Speaker, I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Without objection, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers, controls 20 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I reluctantly rise in opposition to the measure before us, the so-called Private Property Rights Protection Act. Now, while the goal of this legislation to protect property owners and tenants from the abuse of eminent domain is laudable and important, it would in reality supplant the work states have already done to respond to the Supreme Court's decision in Kelo versus City of New London in the 7 years since the court handed down that decision. Most importantly, whatever the concerns my colleagues may have about the Kelo decision, the use and abuse of the power of eminent domain, I hope that every member would look very carefully at the penalty it will impose on states, counties, cities, and towns across the country, even if they never take a single piece of property, even if a jurisdiction never uses eminent domain at all. The mere possibility that some future administration would use eminent domain in a prohibited manner would cast a permanent cloud over the jurisdiction's finances. The risk of the catastrophic penalties being imposed over the life of a 10-year or 20-year bond would be enough to destroy or mitigate a city or state's ability to float bonds at any time, for any reason. At the very least, our cities and states would be forced to pay a risk premium that would make us the envy of Greece. And while it would destroy the finances of every community in the country, it would still allow some of the most flagrant abuses of eminent domain today. One glaring example is that of Keystone XL pipeline, and all pipelines is specifically exempted. Even now, when a Canadian company is threatening farm families with eminent domain for a project that hasn't even been approved, this bill would give TransCanada a free pass. Whatever your concerns, this bill is not the right answer to a very important question. You see, since 2005, there have been new developments that call into question whether Congress should even act at this point. When this House last considered similar legislation, the Kelo decision was new, and there was real concern that the Supreme Court had opened floodgates to abusive takings of homes, businesses, churches, and farms. The states responded which is their role in our federal system. They responded to the concerns of the people who live in those communities to restrain state power and safeguard property rights. In some cases, the state courts have acted to restrain state governments in ways that the federal law would not. In response to the Kelo decision, states have moved aggressively to reconsider and amend their own eminent domain laws, and so more than 40 states have acted. States have considered carefully the implications of this decision and the needs of their citizens. Congress should not now come charging in after 7 years of work and presume to sit as a national zoning board, arrogating to our national government the right to decide which states have gotten the balance right and deciding which projects are or are not appropriate. And yet my colleagues who decry an intrusive federal government, who exalt states' rights, who demand that the courts defer to the elected branches of government to make important decisions, are not satisfied. They want the courts to interfere. They want a one-size-fits-all, Washington knows best solution. They don't want to respect the way states have dealt with this issue. The power of eminent domain is an extraordinary one and should be used rarely and with great care. All too often, it has been abused for private gain or to benefit some at the expense of others. Had this bill been drawn the appropriate line between permissible and impermissible uses of eminent domain? I think that's one of the questions we really need to consider. We all know the easy cases. As the majority in Kelo said, the city would no doubt be forbidden from taking the petitioner's land for the purpose of conferring a private benefit on a particular party, nor would the city be allowed to take property under the mere pretext of a public purpose when its actual purpose was to bestow a private benefit. But which projects are appropriate and which are not can sometimes be a difficult call. Historically, eminent domain has been used to destroy communities for projects having nothing to do with economic development as prohibited by this bill. For example, highways have cut through neighborhoods, destroying them. I know about that. Many of these communities have been low-income and minority communities, and many of them have yet to recover from the wrecker's ball. Yet this bill would permit those projects to go forward using eminent domain as if nothing had happened. Other projects that have a genuine public purpose would nonetheless be prohibited. There is no rhyme or reason to this legislation. I believe, as I did in 2005, this bill is the incorrect approach to a very serious problem. And that, with Mr. Speaker, I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 6 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Sensenbrenner, who is the sponsor of this legislation and also a former chairman of the Judiciary Committee. After that, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Goodlatte, be allowed to control the remainder of the time.
Without objection. Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 6 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman from Texas for yielding me the time. And I want to state at the beginning that I deeply appreciate my co-sponsor of this legislation, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters. This is a Sensenbrenner-Waters bill. You will never see another Sensenbrenner-Waters bill, and that is probably one of the best reasons to vote in favor of it. But on the merits, I'm pleased that the House of Representatives today is considering H.R. 1433, the Private Property Rights Protection Act. This legislation will prevent economic development from being used as a justification for exercising the power of eminent domain. I first introduced a version of this bill after the 2005 Supreme Court's ruling in Kelo versus City of New London. In this decision, the Court held 5-4 that economic development can be a public use under the Fifth Amendment's Takings Clause, justifying the government's taking of private property and giving it to a private business for use in the interest of creating a more lucrative tax base. As a result of this ruling, the federal government's power of eminent domain has become almost limitless, providing citizens with few means to protect their property. Under the decision, farmers in my state of Wisconsin are particularly vulnerable. The fair market value of farmland is less than residential or commercial property, which means it doesn't generate as much property tax as homes or offices. Uncle Sam can condemn one family's house only because another private entity would pay more in tax revenue. The bill is needed to restore to all Americans the property rights the Supreme Court took away. Although several states have independently passed legislation to limit their power of eminent domain, and the Supreme Courts of Illinois, Michigan, and Ohio have barred the practice under their state constitution, these laws exist on a varying degree. The Private Property Rights Restoration Act will provide American citizens in every state of this country with the means to protect their private property from exceedingly unsubstantiated claims of eminent domain. Under the legislation, if a state or political subdivision of a state uses its eminent domain power to transfer private property to other private parties for economic development, the state is ineligible to receive federal economic development funds for 2 fiscal years, following a judicial determination that the law has been violated. Additionally, the bill prohibits the federal government from using eminent domain for economic development purposes. The protection of property rights is one of the most important tenets of our government. I am mindful of the long history of eminent domain abuses, particularly in low-income and often predominantly minority neighborhoods, and the need to stop it. I am also mindful of the reasons we should allow the government to take land when the way in which the land is being used constitutes an immediate threat to public health and safety. This bill accomplishes both of those goals. The need to ensure property rights are returned to all Americans is as strong now as it was when Kelo was decided. Congress must play a pivotal role in reforming the use and abuse of eminent domain. I urge my colleagues to join me in protecting property rights for all Americans and limiting the dangerous effects of the Kelo decision on the most vulnerable in society. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my pleasure to recognize a senior member of Judiciary Committee, my long-standing friend and supporter for many years, the Honorable Maxine Waters, for as much time as she may consume.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you very much. Mr. Conyers, I want to thank you for not only granting me this time, but for being my friend for many years. And it is odd for me to be on the opposite side of you. This may be the first time, certainly in my career, that we have ever disagreed on anything. And Mr. Sensenbrenner is correct. This will be the only time that we will probably come together around an issue. But we've been together on this one for a long time. And so I rise in strong support for H.R. 1433, the Private Property Rights Protection Act of 2011. This legislation that I joined with Representative Sensenbrenner on will restore the property rights of all Americans and prevent the federal government or any authority of the federal government from using economic development as a justification for exercising its power of eminent domain. Economic development condemnations have all too often been used by powerful interest groups to acquire land at the expense of the poor and politically weak. As the dissent in the Kelo case pointed out, to reason, as the court does, that the incidental public benefits resulting from the subsequent ordinary use of private property render economic development takings for public use is to wash out any distinction between private and public use of property. The beneficiaries are likely to be those citizens with disproportionate influence and power in the political process, including large corporations and development firms. As for the victims, the government now has license to transfer property from those with fewer resources to those with more. The founders cannot have intended this perverse result. Few protested the Kelo ruling more ardently than the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, that is the NAACP. In an amicus brief filed in the case, it argued that the burden of eminent domain has and will continue to fall disproportionately upon racial and ethnic minorities, the elderly, and economically disadvantaged. Unfettered eminent domain authority, the NAACP concluded, is a license for government to coerce individuals on behalf of society's strongest interest. The Private Property Rights Protection Act of 2011 will discourage eminent abuse by denying local governments that take private property for economic development access to federal economic development funds for a period of 2 years. One of the basic constitutional functions of American government is the protection of private property rights. H.R. 1433 will protect homes, communities, churches, and other privately owned property from predatory takings under the guise of economic development. Private developers and local governments that have a genuine project should be able to acquire the land or property they need through legitimate voluntary purchases. If the project really is more valuable than the current use of the same land, then they should be willing to negotiate with property owners who are willing to sell. Eminent domain abuse impacts both urban and rural communities, and it is past time that Congress acted affirmatively to protect the private property rights of all Americans, who all too often are not evenly matched to challenge private companies in lengthy litigation. Where the Supreme Court created ambiguity with its Kelo rulings, Congress must be clear. There should never be a legal question concerning the rights individuals have to be secure in their homes and communities. With that, let me just wrap this up by saying I have been engaged for the past several years with the subprime meltdown in this country that caused so many families to be in foreclosure. And I've been engaged on that subject because I consider the home the most precious asset, the most precious possession that any American can have. And so whether it's trying to protect people who got involved in mortgages that they did not understand, mortgages where they were suckered into signing on the dotted line because we had exotic products that had been put into the marketplace which now caused them to lose that home, or whether it is the pure question of eminent domain. Property ownership is the basic of our American government, and protected should be always by the Constitution and the members who are elected to come to Congress to uphold the Constitution and protect our citizens. And so today I join with Sensenbrenner, Congressman Sensenbrenner, and others on the opposite side of the aisle in ways that I don't normally do and probably won't have the opportunity to do for a long time to come, but today is important, and we join together in the interest of American citizens who simply want to be able to own their home without their government intervening in their lives and taking their property and saying they're doing it in the name of economic development. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, private ownership of property is vital to our freedom and our prosperity, and is one of the most fundamental principles embedded in our Constitution. The Founders realized the importance of property rights when they codified the Takings Clause of the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, which requires that private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation.
This clause created two conditions to the government taking private property: that the subsequent use of the property is for the public, and that the government gives the property owners just compensation. However, the Supreme Court's 5-4 decision in Kelo versus City of New London was a step in the opposite direction. This controversial ruling expanded the ability of state and local governments to exercise eminent domain powers to seize property under the guise of economic development when the public use is as incidental as generating tax revenues or creating jobs, even in situations where the government takes property from one private individual and gives it to another private entity. By defining public use so expansively, the Court essentially erased any protection for private property as understood by the founders of our nation. In the wake of this decision, state and local governments can use eminent domain powers to take the property of any individual for nearly any reason. Cities may now bulldoze private citizens' homes, farms, and small businesses to make way for shopping malls or other developments. For these reasons, I joined with Chairman Sensenbrenner to introduce H.R. 1433, the Private Property Rights Protection Act. I am pleased that H.R. 1433 incorporates many provisions from legislation I co-authored in the 109th Congress, the STOP Act. Specifically, H.R. 1433 would prohibit all federal economic development funds for a period of 2 years for any state or local government that uses economic development as a justification for taking property from one person and giving it to another private entity. In addition, this legislation would allow state and local governments to cure violations by giving the property back to the original owner. Furthermore, this bill specifically grants adversely affected landowners the right to use appropriate legal remedies to enforce the provisions of the bill. H.R. 1433 also includes a carefully crafted definition of economic development that protects traditional uses of eminent domain, such as taking land for public uses like roads, while prohibiting abuses of eminent domain powers. No one should have to live in fear of the government snatching up their home, farm, or business, and the Private Property Rights Protection Act will help to create the incentives to ensure that these abuses do not occur in the future. I urge my colleagues to support this important piece of legislation and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased now to recognize the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, Sheila Jackson Lee, for 3 minutes.
Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the distinguished chairman and the manager of the legislation, distinguished gentleman from Virginia, and look forward to joining in supporting this legislation, H.R. 1433. This is a legislation that has been long in coming. It is a bipartisan initiative, and I think it is particularly important when we speak to our colleagues who are representing the American public to be able to say that property is valuable, that the Bill of Rights that requires due process before a taking is being reinforced by this legislation. H.R. 1433 would prohibit a state or political subdivision from exercising its power of eminent domain or allowing the exercise of such power by delegation over property to be used for economic development or over property that is used for economic development within 7 years after that exercise if the state or political subdivision received federal economic development funds during any fiscal year in which the property is so used or intended to be used. Texas has faced a number of incidences, Mr. Speaker. One in particular is after the aftermath of Hurricane Ike. Although there are different laws dealing with coastal properties, I see the pain or saw the pain in a number of beach owners' faces as their property was condemned, even though they were trying to anxiously save it. This bill establishes a private cause of action for any private property owner or tenant who suffers injury as a result of a violation of this act. This helps the little guy. Someone who owns property can actually have a remedy to stand up and challenge the taking of their property. The bill prohibits state immunity in federal or state court and sets the statute of limitations at 7 years. Although I offered an amendment to extend that to 10 years, I was willing to compromise at 7, as well as requiring the Attorney General to bring an action to enforce this act in certain circumstances, but prohibits an action brought later than 7 years following the conclusion of any condemnation proceedings. And maybe as it makes its way through, we'll have an opportunity to expand that 7-year period. These are the efforts of Mr. Sensenbrenner and Congresswoman Waters, along with the rest of us who co-sponsored this amendment. 3 amendments I offered to the bill. Some of them were accepted. My first amendment requires that a study be conducted to identify the number of minorities versus non-minorities who will be impacted by the Act, in addition to the median incomes of those who are mostly highly affected. My second amendment requires the United States Attorney General to locate and inform members of minority communities if it is determined that the Act has a disproportionate impact. Both of those amendments, I believe, were accepted.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the gentlelady 3 additional minutes.
Without objection.
I thank the gentleman. I also offered one to ensure that states are required to pay penalties and interest in cases where they run afoul of this bill. I am well aware of the needs of local communities and the needs of economic development, but I am glad that this Congress seeks today to stand up on behalf of private property rights and owners. I am delighted that in the course of working in particular with this issue, we have a fair and balanced approach. Let me just give you a very brief example, and I thank the gentleman for his courtesies. The history of eminent domain is rife with abuse specifically targeting racial and ethnic and poor neighborhoods. Now, redlining may not be equated to condemning neighborhoods or eminent domain, but when you don't allow a neighborhood to refurbish itself, to refinance, you are putting it in the line quickly for being a target of eminent domain. A 2004 study estimated that 1,600 African-American neighborhoods were destroyed by municipal projects in Los Angeles. In San Jose, California, 95% of the properties targeted for economic redevelopment are Hispanic or Asian-owned, despite the fact that only 30% of businesses in that area are owned by racial or ethnic minorities. In Mount Holy Township, New Jersey, officials have targeted for economic development a neighborhood which the percentage of African-American residents, 44%, is twice that of the entire township and nearly triple that of Burlington County. Lastly, according to a 1989 study, 90% of the 10,000 families displaced by highway projects in Baltimore were African Americans. In my own home state of Texas, I remember a very well-stocked neighborhood of teachers and various blue-collar workers. We called it Third Ward, Riverside, thriving area. Schools were schools like E.O. Smith and Jack Yates High School. And in the course of trying to develop a major highway, in fact, that neighborhood was ultimately, in essence, diminished greatly. So as growth comes, I understand it, but I think this is an excellent balance. I want economic development. I want to see growth, but I'd like it to support and encourage thriving neighborhoods of all backgrounds and diversity. This legislation will help in doing so, and I believe that it will correct decisions made previously and allow Texans, allow Californians, New Yorkers, Midwesterners, Southerners, Northerners, Easterners, and Westerners to have a fair balance when the government comes and says it's time to take your property. I ask my colleagues to support this legislation, and with the distinguished gentleman's courtesy, I yield back my time.
Gentlewoman yields. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I think we have the right to close, and we reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers, and I am prepared to return the balance of my time.
Gentleman
I yield myself such time as may consume to say that I urge my colleagues to adopt this bipartisan legislation to restore meaning to the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. As Justice Sandra Day O'Connor noted in her dissent in that opinion, the Kelo decision effectively renders meaningless the protections under this law because as the interpretation exists, as the court ruling exists, state and local governments can seize property for almost any reason under the context of calling it for purposes of economic development, and we need to change that. We need to make sure that private property is what people think it is, and that is something that they have the right to own and not be interfered with by the government, except for real purposes of eminent domain, taking land for pure public uses like roads and utilities and schools and other clearly public uses. And I urge my colleagues to support the legislation and yield back the balance of my time.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1433 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The Chair lays before the House a communication.
The Honorable the Speaker, House of Representatives. Sir, this is to notify you formally pursuant to Rule 8 of the Rules of the House of Representatives that I have been served with a trial subpoena ad testificandum issued by the United States District Court for the Northern District of Iowa. After consultation with the Office of General Counsel, I will determine whether compliance with the subpoena is consistent with the privileges and rights of the House. Signed sincerely, Sandra Hanlon, District Representative, Congressman Steve King.
Chair will entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Request permission to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, the administration is bullying religions. Yes, the government has required some religious organizations to violate their tenets and provide certain health care coverage for their employees or else. After an immediate backlash by the American public, the administration promised that it would make some changes. But the same day that it made this promise, it finalized the original mandate as is with no changes. The original edict is now in effect. The big announcement about a change resulted in nothing, only more words. The administration said it had the power to issue this order because it was implementing Obamacare. If the administration has the power to infringe upon a constitutionally protected right, what will follow? What individual freedom will be trampled next, all in the name we're the government, we know what's best? The Constitution is being insulted and violated. We should fear this type of unyielding power and religious persecution. After all, the Constitution was written to protect us from this type of government. And that's just the way it is.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in memory of Marilyn Schmidt, a resident of the state of Michigan who dedicated her life to the goal of achieving true universal health care for all Americans. She spent countless hours, day in and day out, organizing, mobilizing, and educating the citizens of Michigan in order to build grassroots support for passage of a single-payer bill in Congress, H.R. 676. She passionately believed that every person in America should have access to quality, affordable, and accessible health care as a fundamental civil and human right. I knew Mrs. Schmidt for almost 2 decades. I had a profound respect for her unique leadership in advocating for human rights universal health care, and protecting Social Security and Medicare. She belonged to numerous community and social justice organizations, including the Michigan Improved Medicare for All, the Michigan Alliance to Strengthen the Social Security and Medicare, the Michigan Universal Health Care Access Network, and the Oakland County Welfare Rights Organization. For over 20 years, she fought for human, economic, and civil rights of the voiceless and the vulnerable citizens of Michigan who wanted nothing more than a better life for themselves and their children. Thank you, Marilyn Schmidt, for remaining steadfast in your belief that health care should be a fundamental human right in this country. The people of Michigan and all of those you helped and fought for will always remember your kindness, your courage, and dedication to this just cause.
Time's expired. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader. Chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the President of the United States.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Secretary.
I'm directed by the President of the United States to deliver to the House of Representatives a message in writing.
Gentleman from California may proceed.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I look forward to this hour with my colleagues to talk about jobs. How do we create jobs in America? We're now well over 14 months of the Republican control of this House, and not one significant bill has passed this House that would create new jobs. Many bills to wipe out environmental laws, many bills to wipe out regulations that protect the citizens of the United States from pollution and contamination of one sort or another. But where are the job bills? We absolutely have to create the jobs in America, and today we're going to take about an hour to discuss how we can create jobs in America. One of the principal ways is to make it in America. Manufacturing matters. Manufacturing was the heart and soul, the foundation for the great middle class, the rise of the middle class here in the United States. It wasn't too long ago that manufacturing in the United States was a big deal. About 23 years ago, we had almost 20 million Americans in manufacturing. It also happened to coincide with the largest percentage of Americans that were in the middle class. Over the intervening years, we've seen a slow decline until we hit this period of 2000 to 2009. And we saw a precipitous drop to just over 11 million manufacturing jobs in America. That coincided with the decline of the middle class in the United States. So what we want to do today is to focus on how can we rebuild the American middle class. One of the principal ways of doing it is to focus on manufacturing and to focus specifically on rebuilding the great manufacturing sector in the United States. Many, many ways to do this. I notice my colleague from Oregon is here to join us, and I know that there are many things that are happening in Oregon that speak directly to this, one of which is competition between Oregon and California for the manufacturing of light rail cars. I'll let my colleague from Oregon go first, and then I'll pound on him that California is a better place to manufacture light rail cars than Oregon. But either way, they're made in America, and that's to the benefit of all Americans. Please join me, and let's see where we can take this.
Thank you. I deeply appreciate your courtesy in permitting me to speak. I appreciate your leadership in focusing on the need to rebuild and renew this country, putting Americans back to work, being able to not just revitalize our economy, but our neighborhoods and strengthen our families. It is true that there are some areas where there are some great opportunities for healthy competition. The gentleman may be referencing the fact that recently we have started manufacturing a streetcar in the United States for the first time in 58 years, and it's being manufactured in Portland, Oregon. But I would note that that project, manufacturing the streetcar, includes the work of subcontractors across the country, including 40 in the Midwest that had been so hard hit by some of the decline in manufacturing activity. The point is that being able to make goods in this country that, whether it's light rail, streetcar, heavy rail, whether we're dealing with fabricating steel for bridges and roads, rebuilding the power grid, these are all areas that are a tremendous source of family wage jobs. I find no amount of irony that one of the major Republican candidates for president somehow thought that President Obama was being, and I'm using his direct word, elitist by advocating that young people have the chance for a college education or going to a community college. My goodness, how out of touch can you possibly be? I don't know any American that doesn't want his or her child to be able to have the opportunity for further education and training. This is part of an agenda here. I look forward to the conversation this evening. At one point, I'd like to cycle back to the spectacle we had on the floor of the House the week before we recessed for President's Day, where we had the most partisan transportation bill in the history of the House, narrow in focus, small in vision, dividing the various elements of transportation, and that was so bad that our Republican friends were embarrassed to even have a hearing on it. Never before in the history of the House have we had a major surface transportation reauthorization that never even had a hearing. Well, mercifully, our Republican friends have decided that that wasn't getting them anywhere. The outcry from transit agencies across the country, from cyclists, even from the people who advocate safe routes to school, the program designed for our children to be able to get back and forth to school safely, that they eliminated, so they put that on the back burner. But the point is, you are right. We've enjoyed, if I can use that term, their Republican leadership of the House for 14 months. We have no economic development plan. We have no transportation bill. And we continue to have an opportunity to rebuild and renew America languishing.
Well, thank you so very much for circling back to the transportation issue. That issue is still before this House. There has been no hearing, and the bill that was put forth by the Republicans simply has gone nowhere. In fact, it hit the brick wall. And I'm sure one of the reasons it hit the brick wall is that there was no way to create a modern transportation system in that bill. For example, we both talked about streetcars and light rail cars. in California, there is a factory near Sacramento that makes light rail cars. I'm delighted there's a factory now in Oregon, Portland, that is building streetcars. And the factory in Sacramento is also building locomotives. The reason this is happening is that the Democrats in the recovery legislation, the stimulus bill that gets such bad press, totally undeserved, I might add, actually had a clause in it that American taxpayers' money was going to be used to make it in America. And that started or propelled both of these operations as cities decided they would use some of their own money, some state money, and some of the federal money to enhance their public transportation programs. However, the transportation bill that you brought up just a moment ago totally removes the public transportation sector from the bill. Now, I don't know how we're ever going to build buses and trains and light rail, Amtrak, without the support of the federal government. I know you were deeply involved in this. I heard you talk about this once before with a little bit of animation. You may want to circle back and pick that up again.
Well, I appreciate the invitation. You know, today, as we speak, people in Michigan are voting in a presidential primary to help determine the Republican nominee. I just mentioned one of them, my friend and former colleague here, Rick Santorum, with whom I served in the House, is the person who thinks it's elitist that American families have an opportunity for their kids to go to school. The other major contender, the gentleman who is likely to even win the ballot in Michigan today, more Republican votes, has been quoted as saying one of his top targets, if he's elected president, would be to eliminate Amtrak. You know,
Seriously?
Yesterday,
I've heard him say a lot of things.
Yesterday he was on the trail. This is one of his top 5 projects, targets.
Is this Mr. Romney?
Mr. Romney wants to eliminate the funding for Amtrak. This is one of his targets. Well, you know, the United States is, well, in the past, I have actually been brought up short when I've talked about the United States having a third world rail passenger system. Because, you know, I've ridden railroads in places like Malaysia or Thailand, and we do an injustice to their rail systems. The United States is the only major country in the world that does not have higher speed rail passenger service. It is the only major country that has no plan to move forward. The President, to his credit, put forth $14 billion to be able to strengthen our rail passenger system, some of which, several billion, would have helped with the California vision. The California voters have approved and an opportunity to go forward. You know, it is frustrating for me because there is no doubt that Americans will have higher speed rail over the course of the next quarter century. No doubt. But the question is, coming back to the point that you have so relentlessly and eloquently developed on the floor here, Congressman Guillemendi, is the notion of where will America's rail system come from? Because the path we're on, if we follow it with Romney, who would zero it out, with Republicans who have fought these investments every chance they get, the high-speed rail we'll have will be built and operated by the Chinese. They'll design it, they'll build it, the value will be added in another country, and we'll pay for the privilege. The alternative is to invest here in the United States in the tracks, the signals, the equipment to be able to revitalize a vital system of transportation, taking pressure off of airports and roads. But as I say, the choice is whether or not we're going to build it, we're going to own it,